you imagine what that would have been like in 1806? Bringing your boat, all your worldly belongings, 3 children, and we understand a cow on the boat, and landed right here. That's the historic land. That's the only place to get on and off the island.
This is Bob Duchesne's Wild Maine. Today, we're going to a part of Acadia National Park you've never been to. Sure, you've been to Bar Harbor, Northeast Harbor, Southwest Harbor, Bass Harbor, all the harbors. You've been to Sand Beach, Thunder Hole, and Otter Cliff. You've been to the top of Cadillac. You've been over to Scoodic Point. You may have even been out to Isle of Ho. But you have not been where we're going today. You may not even know it's part of the park. And it's got a unique history all its own. The island we're going to doesn't even have a dock. We're actually taking one boat to get there and dragging another boat along behind us to get us from the big boat to the beach. And we're bringing a National Park Ranger along with us. Just when you thought you knew all about Acadia National Park, this show comes along and spoils it. Bob Duchesne's Wild Maine is brought to you by Hammond Lumber, Doors Equipment, Bar Harbor Whale Watch, Napa Auto Parts, EBS, and a Supercuts location near you. Baker Island. It's 130 acres of history. It's about 6 miles southeast of Southwest Harbor, just beyond the Cranberry Isles. It's got a lighthouse you probably don't even know about. 5 days a week, Bar Harbor Whale Watch sends one of its smaller boats over there. The Miss Samantha, which is well known as the boat that tourists board to encounter seals and lobsters and sightseeing along the coast. But Tuesday through Saturday mornings, it makes the run over to Baker Island. It's just an hour each way, and then you get a ranger tour and a couple of hours to explore this most secret part of Acadia. Because there's no dock on the island, the Miss Samantha tows a skiff that we'll use for getting to the beach. At the helm, Captain Andrew.
Both boats are Coast Guard inspected, so we've got a ton of safety gear on both vessels. I'm required to point out what we have on this boat. So as you boarded, there's a man overboard davit.
Okay, we can skip the safety part. And we can skip ahead of the guy we'll get to know better.
Yeah, welcome aboard, folks. I am Ranger John from Acadia National Park. Everybody been in the park yet? What's special about the park this year, folks? That's right, it's our centennial, the centennial of the birth of Acadia National Park. I'm going to talk about that today a little bit. It was 1916 when it got started. Okay, here's your first test question. Who was president 1916? Wilson, yeah. Woodrow Wilson signed Acadia National Park into being. Actually, the names have changed and the status has changed a little bit, but I'm going to talk about that a little bit today. We're pretty much heading straight to Baker. I want y'all to kind of use your imagination for just a moment. Taking a look over here to the right, you see these 2 sailing vessels. Margaret Todd is the only 4-masted schooner still sailing in New England. Beautiful vessel. But imagine, folks, being here over 100 years ago, the harbor would have been filled with vessels like that, of all kinds, from the very small sailing vessels to rowboats to even larger schooners than you see there. And actually, square riggers. Big sailing vessels. They would have been everywhere that you could see. All this area here would have been much, much different because the islands, most of these would have been bare of trees back then. Everywhere you looked, every little nook and cranny, there was something going on. Fish drying, lumbering. They would sell ice in the winter, load it up on vessels just like that and take it to places like New York. Everywhere you would look in this harbor was industry, boat building. And now people come for lobster.
Okay, a little bit about our ranger. He's John Magaha. For most of his adult life, he was a Navy chief. Upon retirement from the Navy, he ended up in the National Park Service and has spent the last 5 years at a bunch of different parks. He was in Kenai, Alaska before coming to Maine, and the Great Smoky Mountains in Tennessee before that. As you can tell, he likes history. The Miss Samantha is a converted lobster boat, and it's the boat Bar Harbor Whale Watch takes around for close-in tourism excursions. They've got a lobster tank up front, and everybody takes a look, because almost nobody on this boat right now is from Maine. Lobsters always get mentioned on every tour boat in Maine.
Yep, a classic scene here in Maine. The lobstermen checking their traps. They do that about at least every other day. They can set as many as 400 and work those traps.
Wait, what? 400?
Well, once again, Captain Andrew of the 21st century had to correct me. My numbers were a little skewed on how many lobster traps. He told me that a lobsterman can get work as many as 800 traps.
Now, every tour boat leaving Bar Harbor goes one of two ways. You can cross Frenchman's Bay over to Schoodic Point, or you can go down the shoreline of the park heading south. When that happens, you just can't pass a certain island without explaining just how famous it is. In fact, it got famous in the 1600s.
Yeah, off to the left, folks, over here to the left of the boat, you see a lighthouse, the famous Egg Rock Lighthouse. If you don't see it quite yet, you will be seeing it very soon. Off to the left, it's actually quite close to us. Egg Rock got its name because seabirds lay eggs on that rock. That's really it was a very important seabird nesting area. And when Champlain, who was exploring the area in 1604, came in, he said his men found over 600 dozen eggs on that island. That had been pretty much at the peak of the seabird nesting area. And they, like everybody else, would collect birds, eggs, like the Guillemot eggs, many species of eggs. They would collect them through the next several centuries, and they put the lighthouse there in 1875.
And it doesn't really matter which of the Bar Harbor Whale Watch boats you get on, you're going to see marine wildlife.
The captain spotted some harbor porpoise off to the left. Says they're out there a ways, but they're active. We'll be looking for the black fin as it pops up on the water. There they are. The harbor porpoise is very common, folks. We're very likely to see them again, even closer up. The porpoise is actually in the cetacean group. It's a toothed whale, a small toothed whale. You only get about 5 to 6 feet long, an average, 150 pounds. They're not like many other species of porpoise that are interested in playing with the boats. Oh, we have something off to the left. There we go, right here, close to us, right up close.
So, it's an hour ride to Baker Island. Along the way, scenery, porpoises, seals, birds, and you can come down to the front of the Miss Samantha and play with the lobsters. Let's skip ahead to the island, though. It'll take this Bar Harbor Whale Watch boat another half an hour to get there, but it'll take you only 3 minutes. This is Bob Duchesne's Wild Maine on Sports Radio 92.9, The Ticket. Welcome back to Bob Duchesne's Wild Maine on Sports Radio 92.9, The Ticket. If you've just joined us, let me set the scene. I'm on board the Miss Samantha, one of the vessels in the fleet of boats operated by Bar Harbor Whale Watch. I've been on all the others, but this is my first time on this one because we're going to a piece of Acadia National Park that almost nobody knows about, not even native Mainers. It's called Baker Island. We've just anchored offshore. The crew is shuttling us to shore, and the voice you'll hear most often comes from Ranger John Magaha, an Acadia National Park ranger. But first things first, there's no dock in this island. Anyone who visits either lands in a skiff on the 10-foot section of beach that's actually accessible, or paddles over here. In our case, the Miss Samantha brings a skiff big enough to take about 10 people at a time to shore. This skiff was especially designed for this, with a drop-down ramp in front that you can just walk across and never get your feet wet. Not bad.
All right, just have a seat, and we'll get going.
Once again, Baker Island is just beyond the Cranberry Isles, but not as far out as Great Duck and Little Duck Islands, if you're keeping track of the map. It's rock-bound all the way around, except at this one landing spot. It takes less than a minute to reach the beach.
All right, let's just move right on up here, folks.
We're on the beach. Up the hill, there are a couple of small houses. They look old. Beyond that, a couple of other buildings that look even older. There's a mowed path up the hill and a tall grass field surrounding it. But all the rest of the island is completely wooded. A couple of hundred years ago, there probably weren't a lot of trees here.
If we can gather around up here, folks. Was it an enjoyable boat ride?
Yes.
Welcome to Baker Island. Wow, and a great day, too. It's a beautiful day. Yeah, amazing little island here. And what I'm going to do today, folks, I'm just going to share some of the history. That's what park rangers do. I'm going to share a little history of Baker Island, which is now mostly owned by Acadia National Park, with just a few exceptions. Little red house up here, little schoolhouse. We're going to be walking by those. Those are actually privately owned. So when we're walking by there, and the families are here on the island today, it's just not really kind to be peering through their windows, okay? The houses, they are from the 1890s. We'll just bypass them, but I'm going to talk about those a little bit and the rest of the island. So there's a little sign here. Park put out about the island and the family that would live here for a little over 100 years. It was the Gillies. We're going to talk about the family today and what brought them here and what kept them here on this little island. I want you to try to imagine, folks. It's 1806. Nobody lives here. Just a few small, very small settled towns on Mount Desert Island. And you and your wife and 3 little children come over in your boat with all your worldly belongings to here. And there's nothing here but trees and grass and rock. And you're going to eke out a living here. And that is what we're going to talk about as we move on to the island today. Now, take a look at where you are, kind of get an idea and orient yourself as we move about, because we all have to be back down here no later than 11:15. We must get back on the boat. They'll be here on the beach at 11:15. If for some reason you're not able to make it back, that's okay. We will wave by as we're pulling away. But remember, there's no pizza delivery on Baker Island. So we would like to be back here on time. We have to cruise. And then we're going to take a really nice, much beautiful cruise back up closer inshore. And I'll do a little more talking and tell you about the sights around the area. But right now, we're on Baker. It is beautiful. Let's walk up Main Street, Baker Island. This way.
So we follow the leader. Off the beach and just a short distance up into the field along the mowed path.
Can you imagine what that would have been like in 1806? Bringing your boat, all your worldly belongings, 3 children, and we understand a cow on the boat, and landed right here. That's the historic land. That's the only place to get on and off the island, and that's where the Gillies would come about 1806. Imagine y'all coming here, a family, 3 little kids, but we understand Mr. Gilly was a big strapping man of over 200 pounds, over 6 feet tall, and Hannah Gilly was a pretty big strapping woman herself. Tough people. They're pioneering here, folks. Coming from over on Mount Desert Island, from the area of Southwest Harbor. Why do you think he came here? Any idea? I'll give you a hint. He is a fisherman. That's what he mostly does. Why would he come here?
Free land.
Big one there, yes. And also, to get to your fishing grounds, you either got to sail or row. But if you have an island, like they had here, you can be a little closer to the fish. And they were. And nobody else had laid claim to the island. They knew of nobody who held claim to it. So Mr. and Mrs. Gilly, come here and just take possession of it. And they build quite a going concern here. Over the next 10 years, they would have 9 more children. 12 children total. 6 boys and 6 girls. That worked out pretty well. And I'll tell you why. But yeah, 12 kids. You know what's really good about that? Back when you had a farm?
Free labor.
That's your labor force. That's right, free labor. And labor they had to do. But imagine how they had to eke a living out of the land and the sea. Now, he was a fisherman, but he also cut lumber. But you can't just eat fish all the time. You know, you need a potato every now and then, right? Or some other fresh vegetables. They turned the island into somewhat of a profitable farm, at least a comfortable place to live with their 12 children. Somewhere here, we don't know exactly where, they would have built their very first home. Probably a log cabin. We understand eventually they were able to take some of the lumber over to one of the sawmills on Mount Desert Island, have it cut, and build structures like you see here. Over here, a little red house. But they would turn this into a farm. At low tide, folks, you can actually walk across to Cranberry Islands. You can walk across. But only at low tide and only during part of the year. Much of the year in this wintertime, you are here and you're not going anywhere. And there's not much to be had over there anyway. But they would start with a farm, and we understand that they would eventually have a couple of ox, a yoke of oxen is what they called it, 50 sheep at least, several cows, hogs, lots of chickens, and it would become a successful farm. What did they use all those sheep for? What did you use wool for? That was good. Yes. They wore mostly wool. They wove the wool. That was mostly the young ladies would do that. Mom, they wove wool. They did grow some flax here that they can turn into a little rougher linen. If they could and when they could, they might get a little cotton, but they didn't raise it here. Flour didn't become cheap till a little later, so they would raise a little wheat here and have that ground over in mills on Mount Desert Island and brought back. But the life here on the farm, a growing farm and a growing family. They also would sell what they would produce. They would sell their fish. It's a little bit different. There were boat houses down here, folks, that they would build. There would be boats pulled in here and drying racks because they would catch cod and dry them on the racks here. They would catch herring and smoke them. They would actually have lumber brought over, their lumber taken over and brought back, and they would build boxes to put smoked herring in, and that would go as far as New York City. They would sell, what do you think the girls would do on the island? What do the children do? What do you think? What was their jobs on a farm? Feeding animals, milking. Yeah, what do you get from milk other than just milk? Cheese and butter. Very, very important for the butter. Churning butter. Churning butter because actually butter became their best seller. They sold a lot of things here. They sold the fish, they sold lumber, they sold butter, and they sold feathers. Look right here. See this little island right here? Covered in birds. We have some cormorants. We have gulls. They're probably out here. We'll be able to see some eider ducks. There's a lot of bird species. They sold feathers. Lots of feathers. As a matter of fact, back then, the birds were so prolific, they said they could shoot so many birds in the season, they would just pluck the feathers and throw the birds away. That they couldn't eat. Feathers. They sold the feathers. Of course, they made, they had to have stuffed their mattresses and stuffed their big blankets. If you don't know about New England, it gets a little nippy here in the winter time, right? You need some pretty good blankets, wool blankets and stuff. But they sold a lot of feathers because that was a big fashion, especially in the big cities and in Europe. Women with the big feathery hats sold feathers. Money, hard money, good currency here. Selling the butter, selling the lumber. They also sold the rocks. Yes, this wasn't just the Gillies here. This was up the coast. They sold these because if you've ever walked on the cobblestone streets of Boston, maybe Philadelphia, and New York City, some of those very cobblestones have been washed up in the surf for thousands of years, forming stones. This is a very common area. They used to sell them tons and tons, 100 tons of rock, of cobblestones may leave here. And the young men would be loading these things off of the cobblestone beaches around the area. Stone. So for the next 10 years, it was becoming a very good farm. We understand with 12 children, and folks, you may have known, if you go into the older cemeteries, one thing you do note is there's a lot of graves from children. Not here. The Gilley family, all 12 children lived into their 80s and even into their 90s. Unheard of. Must have been something about the open air, the labor, the food was in abundance. Probably being out here, not too much disease could reach you, but they had a nice, I guess they were pretty content out here. And things even got a little better. And I'll show you how. We're going to move right on up Main Street and continue.
Ranger John McGaha is taking us a little further up into the field. Plan is to get the history of this Acadia National Park secret spot, then get up the hill to the lighthouse, then down through the woods behind it to a secluded piece of the shoreline where they actually held parties a century ago. Well, that's the plan anyway. When Bob Duchesne's Wild Maine returns to Baker Island in about 3 minutes, we'll see if we can stick to that plan. This is Sports Radio 92.9, The Ticket. This is Bob Duchesne's Wild Maine on Sports Radio 92.9, The Ticket. Saturday mornings at 9, Sunday mornings at 8. Today's show is taking place in one of the most secret spots of Acadia National Park, Baker Island. Most Mainers couldn't find it on a map, and even more wouldn't know it's part of Acadia National Park. Bar Harbor Whale Watch sends the Miss Samantha over here 5 mornings a week, along with a park ranger. And that ranger today is John McGaha. We're now up in the field below the cabins on the island. This was all crops a century ago. Most of the island is trees now, but it wasn't then. Actually, if there's one thing on this island more common than trees, it has got to be
rocks! Lots and lots of rocks. These fields are filled with rocks. They didn't just stack them up because it was beautiful. We find them aesthetically pleasing. Then, folks, they would have found them to be a real hassle back then. I read an interesting number just recently for New England, that by the late 1880s, there was 240,000 miles of rock walls. They had to put the rock somewhere, and they stacked it up, and it's showing that in the pictures there. As they were building their farm. More houses, the children were growing up. Now, life on the island, there was always something to do. Now, the boys, I understand, by the time they were 12, they could build their own boat, and they were out hunting. They did a lot of hunting, taking the food, the birds for food, and also for the feathers, quite a bit. Now, I understand also all the children mostly went barefooted most of the year. You couldn't imagine doing that in February, could you? But the oldest son would learn the cobbler trade, and he was able to keep the children in shoes at least through the winter. Yeah, but what you're looking at here is a common structure that was eventually able to be built. This was one of the older boys. This is Elijah Gilley's house. And you can kind of tell, and he had quite a number of kids of his own, and you kind of see that. You got the main structure built on. This was common. You add a wing when you have another child or 2 or 3. You just get bigger and bigger. And this is his house. This is one of the oldest children. He stayed on the island, and he would be a fisherman and a farmer and all the other things. This was a really neat picture of Elijah Gilley sitting on the front porch of his house, mending his old fishing net. This is in the late 1800s. Another common scene in the area, drying racks for cod from the 1800s. Very common sign, even here on the island. As I mentioned, lots of sailboats. Because the boats, many of these islands, many of them were occupied. Fishermen coming in for the season, and sailing vessels would stop by the islands, buy your fish, buy whatever you had to sell, and take it to places like Boston and New York, Philadelphia, And that's how they made a little bit of their money here. It got even a little better, folks. We're going to step right up there, and I'll tell you how and why.
So Ranger John is giving us a sense of history as it unfolds. He's got photos of what this might have looked like a century ago and accounts of what it looked like 2 centuries ago, before Maine was even a state. There were people settled along the coast. Most islands were more heavily used then than they are now because fishermen were closer to the fish out here. You can see where the original cottages would have been down by the water. You can see the larger 100-year-old buildings farther up the hill here. As the decades pass, these waters begin to see bigger and bigger vessels. And as you know, these waters are full of rocks, ledges, and islands, and fog. Maine is only 8 years old when life on Baker Island changes again. And from where we're standing in the secret place of Acadia National Park, we can actually see it.
So we got a good farm going, got a good thing going. We're expanding, we're clearing the fields all the way around here. The family's growing. Now, before the trains, before the cars came, everything got here by boat. And especially after the 1850s, when more people like yourselves are coming, because of the beautiful Bar Harbor area and Mount Desert Island, that increased a lot of the traffic. So this is dangerous waters, folks, very treacherous waters. Yesterday I was on the Margaret Todd. We were out just 5 minutes and the fog just rolled in and we couldn't see anything. Now you run your ship aground down, say in Florida, you're mostly on sand, not a big deal. You can get beat to death in the surf, but if you run your vessel aground out here, you're mostly running up on granite, and that's going to leave a mark. Actually, usually a big old hole. They've lost a lot of vessels here. The Coast Guard would come in and would start building lighthouses. One of the very earliest ones was on this island. In 1828, Baker Island got a lighthouse. They would also establish, all on the New England coast, all the way down to Florida, life-saving stations. That's what you're looking at across the water. You got a beautiful view of the lighthouse and life-saving stations in the worst of weather. The men of these life-saving stations would row their boats out in storms and rescue people stranded in boats, sinking vessels. Saved a lot of lives all the way up and down the coast. So, in 1828, the government puts a lighthouse on Baker Island. It's very convenient. The Gillies are here. You got a grown man. They make Mr. Gilly the first lightkeeper. Now this is a big deal, folks, because not only did they get a lighthouse, they got a lightkeeper's house. And $350 a year. 1828, folks, that's big money. What we call down south where I'm from, that's some serious folding money right there. That was very good. And they got all the well oil they could use. What did they use the well oil for? They didn't bathe in it. Well oil lit the lighthouses. Well oil actually lit the country until we had things like petroleum, like kerosene. And it lit the light on Baker Island. I did read where apparently the Gillies liked to burn into the wee hours. The government had to come back to them and say, you are using far too much well oil, you've got to cut back. And they would. They would. But now, folks, we have a lighthouse. He's kind of increased his status. He's not just a fisherman, he's the lightkeeper. And who appoints lightkeepers? Back then, it was the President of the United States. Things were good. They got some extra money. They got an extra house. Things are pretty good here on the island. Let's move on up, but things are going to change again. And we're going to move on up. One more stop, a little more of the story, and then I'm going to set you free.
We're on Baker Island with Ranger John. This was a working island years ago. Right now, it's still got a working lighthouse and a few ancient cottages. Otherwise, it's one of the most secret places in Acadia National Park. Coming up, if you think politics in America today are screwy, you can be assured that they weren't perfect in the mid-19th century either. Politics came from Washington to this very spot, and you should hear what happens next. In fact, you will hear what happens next right after the break. This is Bob Duchesne's Wild Maine on Sports Radio 92.9 The Ticket. This is Bob Duchesne's Wild Maine on Sports Radio 92.9 The Ticket. Today's show is out on Baker Island, an island southeast of Southwest Harbor, just past the Cranberry Isles. We got here courtesy of Bar Harbor Whale Watch, and this is as good a time as any to remind you about something this show is going to do with Bar Harbor Whale Watch on September 10th. On that day, we're taking one of their fast catamarans from Bar Harbor all the way around and up the Penobscot River to Bangor. We'll be passing 10 lighthouses along the way. I'll be sharing the microphone with Chief Naturalist Zach Cliver, and everybody on board is going to be treated to a unique adventure filled with scenery, history, and wildlife. We'll take all day, 9 a.m. to 6 p.m. They've never done this before, so this is going to be quite the day. If you're interested, it's barharborwhales.com. barharborwhales.com. Now then, back to Baker Island. The Gilley family has been out here for a couple of decades. It's now the mid-1800s. The Civil War is not far off. And America's politics are getting weird. Weird enough to reach all the way to a remote island off the Maine coast.
Now we have a lighthouse and a lightkeepers and money. The children are growing up. As somebody mentioned, yes, they would go to the Maine Islands. They would meet people. Now, religion was also important to Mrs. Gilley. We understand that she would load her children, the older ones, into a boat, and they would actually go about 7 miles out around the island to one of the harbors for church. But they had family out there as well, probably stayed overnight as well. That was important to her. But they were growing up. The girls would marry. Some of them would come back to the island. Some would move off onto Mount Desert Island. Some of the boys would marry into the Stanleys. You'll see some other names, especially if you go into, you may have noticed the graveyard, for people did live, and they did die here on the island and pass away. So it was a growing group of people. We don't know exactly how many. Some say it was at the most in the 30s, some say as many as 60, but the census only supports a little over 30 people at any given time here on the island. But things are going all right. Now, Mr. Gilley, now this is not the original 1828 lighthouse. This has been rebuilt, but it is pre-Civil War. That one was built in 1855. The original lighthouse was built out of rubble stone, and it was falling apart. Now, things did change, folks. I mentioned that, as it always does. In 1849, Mr. Gilley's in his 60s, but he's still a strapping man ready to go. But the Whig Party would take control of the White House. Remember the Whigs? I don't, but they were there. And for a short period of time, they were pretty much the contenders against the Democratic Party. The Whigs won the White House. The president appoints the lightkeepers. You're going to appoint people that are part of your party. Mr. Gilley wasn't part of the Whig Party, but he'd been doing this job for so long that we understand he was offered to stay keeper of the lighthouse if he would convert to the Whig Party. And it's reported that he said, with some colorful language, I wouldn't become a Whig for all the lighthouses in the United States. And you know what happened? He's gone. He gets fired. He's out of here. Fortunately, he had made enough money, kept enough money back, that he had bought what's called Big Duck Island. I'm going to show it to you on the other side. Big Duck. And he goes over there in his 60s and to raise cattle. Again, an island with nothing on it, and he would go establish himself. But his wife is in her 60s. She is a little too infirm to go out there. She would visit on occasion, but she would stay over with one of her children on Cranberry until she would die in her 60s. He would live to be in his 90s. 92, he would pass away, but most of those years were spent on the other island. Now, he gets cast out of here. How do you think his children took to the new lightkeepers? Oh, no. And it's well documented. It wasn't well. So if you were the new lightkeeper coming in with your boat, maybe you'd bring some livestock in here. We have stories that they would go back down to the boathouse. Their boat's gone. They would look out there and it's just floating away on the tide. Livestock was disappearing. All kind of antics. The two oldest sons were not very kind to the new lightkeepers. We understand that they built a wooden fence right across Main Street and charged a toll. This is their island, they're saying. It got so bad, by the time the second lightkeeper came in, it was so bad, he sent a message. He wanted a revenue cutter to come in here and get these gillies off this island. They were such a nuisance. But there was a court battle, and the gillies were well known and established, and actually it would rule in their favor. But the government was allowed to purchase 19 acres and the right-of-way to the boat ramp. And those stanchions that you saw, the concrete ones, that's the perimeter marker all around their 19 acres, as well as the way down to the water. Seem to have taken care of the issue. And last, folks, the gillies would remain, some of them, on the island till about the 1930s. By then, motorboats, the outboard motor, inboard motors were becoming very popular and useful, so a lot of families would move off the islands, and by the 1930s, the gillies were gone. In 1955, the lighthouse was shut down, and the last light keepers in 1955. Could you imagine living here? Most everybody's gone up into the 1950s. You're the wife of a light keeper, and there's virtually nobody here. I'll quote one little thing before we get going, just to give you an idea of what this was like. The lightkeeper, right at the end there in 1955, the lightkeeper's wife said in her diary, "We haven't had any summer visitors yet. I can't blame them for not coming because of all the fog. But I wish some people would come here soon so we don't feel like we are the only people living on this wonderful earth."
We're on Baker Island with Ranger John McGaha of Acadia National Park. This is one of the least known parts of the park, unless you take the tour over here with Bar Harbor Whale Watch. So far, we've gotten some of the human history of the island. Up next, we'll get some of the natural history. In fact, we'll go back 20,000 years. This is Bob Duchesne's Wild Maine on Sports Radio 92.9, The Ticket. Welcome back to Bob Duchesne's Wild Maine on Sports Radio 92.9, The Ticket. We're in one of the least visited parts of Acadia National Park today, Baker Island. It's not far offshore, just beyond Southwest Harbor and the Cranberry Isles, but there's no ferry over here, and there isn't even a dock, even if there was a ferry. Most of this island is a secret part of Acadia, and it's visited 5 mornings a week by Miss Samantha, a tour boat operated by Bar Harbor Whale Watch. On board is a park ranger, and this one today is John McGaha, who has a keen sense of history, even if that history is over 10,000 years old. We've walked past the old fields and the settlements, past the lighthouse, and into the woods. Here, there is a bare ledge with some strange markings on it that just scream Ice Age glacier.
So we go back to school a little bit and try to think about what was the name of the last great ice age that came through here? Anybody remember? It's called the Wisconsin Ice Age. Folks, if we were here, right here, let's say just a short 20,000 years ago, we would be a little cooler. Matter of fact, we'd also be a little deeper because above our heads would be over a mile of ice. Here. Stretching way out into the oceans. Much of what we're going to see as we're going back, and I'm going to talk about what shaped Mount Desert Island and the islands around it. But you have evidence of the last ice age right here beneath your feet, because those big sheets of ice would move. They were glaciers, and we have signs of glaciation. And we're talking about over a mile thick, maybe 2 miles in other places. And as that ice moved slowly, just a few inches a day, it took everything with it, actually plucking even large stones from the mountains as it carved them down and moving them along. And we have signs right here. This is actually chatter marks made by stones that were being drug across. grinding across the island in this direction. We see that all over and a lot of the different outcroppings on MDI and the surrounding islands. We have history right here in the rocks. It's a really neat thing to see.
Well, if you like those rocks, let's go meet some more. We're following a foot trail through the woods here on Baker Island, and 5 minutes later, we arrive on the rocky shoreline.
Welcome to the dance floor. We understand life was not all work on the farm, and we mentioned that there are people, summer visitors that would come here. We understand there's a history going back well over 100 years of people coming to this area here and having gatherings, having parties. They actually do call it the dance floor. Actually, just on this other side over here is a much even flatter area of rock. We think probably even more better use for dancing, if you wish. They've used this granite. There are buildings in Europe. There are buildings all the way in Omaha, Nebraska, built from granite quarried on MDI. This is a beautiful outcropping of granite. The violent storms, believe it or not, in the summertime can move these rocks around. As they get coated in ice from the rain, huge storm surges can move rocks around. But it's a beautiful area. All I would like to tell you is I would like you to enjoy your time on the dance floor. Now, I have a radio, and I can call for help if I need to, but I really don't want to because it's going to have to be the Coast Guard that comes and gets us, and it could be hours. So, especially parents, I mean, the first thing that a boy like myself wants to do is jump from rock to rock. I know that, but if anybody slips, it could be a broken bone easy or a head injury. You don't want to get too close to the slippery rocks down here because it could be a long time before we can get anybody off the island. So just please be careful, but feel free to move about. Now give yourself, if you're a quick walker, 15 minutes to get back down to the boat ramp, maybe 20 if you're walking a little slower. You can leave here at any time you want and walk around the lighthouse area and go in that shed. You can move up and down. Some of these rocks, folks, they may look massive, but they're still, some of them just balanced. So be very careful and enjoy your time. And I'll see everybody back on the back at the boat ramp. Yeah, see you back there.
And with that, we're free to explore for about 45 minutes. It's a beautiful day. Some folks sit on the rocks in the southern end of the island that faces away from the inevitable crowds of Acadia National Park over there on the mainland. Some go back up to the lighthouse, especially this little fuel shack that now holds museum items. Me, I just wander up and through some of the back fields where 100 years ago, hard-working Mainers made a living from the earth and the sea. The highest point of the island is only 89 feet, but the view is enough to imagine the sailing vessels that would have been working these waters. Eventually, we're all back on the beach, just as a bald eagle flies right over us.
That's our mechanical bald eagle that we have here at the... Andrew's controlling it from the boat.
The ramp comes down to the skiff, and once again, we'll ferry over to the Miss Samantha in 2 passenger loads.
Everybody's got to look, check it out.
On the ride out, we were in a hurry to get to Baker Island. We weren't too close to the park shoreline, and Ranger John didn't tell us much about it, but the ride back was completely different. Now, every Mainer has driven the Park Loop Road at least once. You know by heart what it looks like from the shoreline. But only a small percentage of Mainers know what it looks like from the water. It gives you a whole new perspective. We swung into outer cliffs and hugged the shoreline past Thunder Hole, pulled in close to Sand Beach. Ranger John explained that Sand Beach really isn't sand, it's mostly crushed shells. We continue back to Bar Harbor past the cottages of the rich and famous, the Vanderbilts, the Pulitzers, and the heirs of the Campbell Soup fortune. I've heard all this before because Bar Harbor Whale Watch offers another boat tour along this stretch, and I took that last summer. This famous part of the Maine coast gets more and more interesting when you can see it from the water and learn its history. So much of this is hidden from the view of most tourists and most native Mainers. And that's the point of a big cruise coming up on September 10th. It's something Bar Harbor Whale Watch has never done before. We're going to take one of the big, comfortable, jet-powered catamarans from Bar Harbor all the way around to the Penobscot River and up to Bangor. Along the way, we'll pass through Eggemogan Reach and under the Deer Isle Bridge, visit Castine Harbor, view Fort Knox and the Penobscot Narrows Bridge, and travel 40 miles up the Penobscot River. I'll be one of the guides in that one, talking mostly about wildlife, Local lighthouse historian Gene Torbeck will talk about the 10 lighthouses we'll pass along the way, with stops at each one of those lights. A representative of the Friends of Fort Knox will be on board to talk about that legendary fortress. We'll enjoy a boxed lunch from Bangor favorite Moe's Barbecue. There has never, ever been a chance to get all this scenery and history in one trip. And we'll take all day to do it on September 10th. You're invited. Get details and tickets at barharborwales.com. barharborwales.com. For now, so long from the Miss Samantha. My thanks to Bar Harbor Whale Watch for this opportunity to visit one of Acadia's most secret spots, Baker Island. My thanks to Acadia Ranger John McGaha for explaining it all. Next week's show hits another historic island, this one in the Kennebec River, just where it flows into Merrymeeting Bay. Anyone can visit this island all summer, but only if you know how. Bob Duchesne's Wild Maine returns next Saturday morning at 9 and Sunday morning at 8. And remember, all shows are archived online at 929theticket.com. It's all brought to you by Hammond Lumber, Doors Equipment, Bar Harbor Whale Watch, Napa Auto Parts, EBS, and a Supercuts location near you. This is Sports Radio 929 The Ticket.